I'm Mike Muha. This is Bill Shea. I'm a Vietnam veteran and a member of Veterans for Peace. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Veterans for Peace before Bill gets started. It's an international organization of military veterans and our associates. We work to increase public awareness of the costs of war, to restrain our government from intervening in the international affairs of other nations, to end the arms race and reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, to seek justice for veterans and victims of war, and to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. That's the national organization. Our local chapter, the Utah Phillips J. David Singer chapter here in Washtenaw County, what we do are, first of all, Martin Luther King presentations like this one. Now, we did one earlier that was a Zoom at U of M was broadcast. We've done what we called Arlington, Michigan, where we had markers for all the military people killed in Afghanistan and Iraq from Michigan, at 230 or so. And we had that on Veterans Day at Veterans Park here in Ann Arbor, on Memorial Day at Grand Circus Park, along with the Detroit chapter of Veterans for Peace. And we did this to honor those that were killed, to provide a place to grieve. And we had, the markers had a picture of the person that died and a little information about them. And several people came over, looked at them, and wanted to take the markers with them because it was their son or their husband, and that was very moving. We also did that to educate people on the cost of war and to educate citizens on the needs of returning veterans from conflicts. In addition to that, we have what we call full disclosure recruiting, where we work with local high schools in the area, talking to students that are thinking about joining the military, have questions about it, and we tell them things that recruiters don't tell them, like if you sign up for a specific specialty, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get it, even though the recruiter will tell you you are. We also have a scholarship program where we award scholarships to people that are in peace studies or conflict resolution programs. We've done that since 2007. We've awarded probably 30 or so scholarships. We accept donations for that, and our major fundraiser is the Concert for Peace, which we have every October at the Ark to raise money. Veterans for Peace aligns with Dr. King's philosophy in several ways. For one is nonviolence. King was a strong advocate of nonviolent resistance, and Veterans for Peace upholds this principle as a core value. Anti-war stance. King was a vocal critic of the Vietnam War and believed in the power of diplomacy over military intervention. And Veterans for Peace shares this stance and works toward ending war as a means of resolving conflicts. Social justice. Dr. King fought for racial and economic justice. Veterans for Peace advocates for the rights of marginalized communities and addresses issues of poverty. Community organizing. Dr. King emphasized the importance of grassroots organizing and community activism. And we, Veterans for Peace, mobilize our members and organize events to raise awareness about issues related to justice and peace. The title of this talk is MLK and War, Then and Now. And Bill will address militarism. Dr. King stand on it in a lot more detail than I'm going to. But keep in mind that military isn't inherently bad or unnecessary, but it can be seen as a two-sided coin. On one hand, you can help maintain national security and protect the country's interests. On the other hand, it can lead to an arms race, weaponization of civilian peacekeepers, and bloated government spending on weapon systems to the detriment of social programs. So, Bill?
All right. I'm Bill Shea. Was in the Marine Corps from 1970 to 1974. A long time ago, but nonetheless. I'm going to talk about MLK's idea about militarism, and the gist of this talk is to define militarism in King's terms, and then define militarism how it seemingly is today, and then make a conjecture about how King would respond to the issues today. So, of course, we all know who MLK is, and for the most part, what he stood for: the struggle against racial injustice, his fight against poverty. But there was a third element that he stood hard fast against: militarism, and more specifically, the Vietnam War. The Nobel lecture of December 11, 1964, he called these three evils injustice, poverty, and war. For King, these elements constituted a, quote, moral and spiritual lag that must be eliminated. They represent a deep and haunting problem confronting modern man. I'm just going to say, for the most part, these are all quotes from King, and so I'm not trying to put words in his mouth. His work throughout the South in the early 60s and his work promoting the Civil Rights Act in the mid-60s clearly were his attempt to address the fundamental social evils. It is clear that the two evils of racism and poverty are connected. There is a huge distinction between the economic haves and the have-nots, where the have-nots are generally grouped into racial and class categories from the haves. But what about militarism? What does it mean in general? Militarism regard military efficiency as the supreme ideal of the state and to place all other interests of the country below those of the military. A second part is the belief of a government or people that a country should maintain a strong military capability and not be afraid to use it to defend or promote national interest. A third one is an ideology which claims that the military is the foundation of a society's security and thereby its most important aspect. A fourth one, the glorification or prevalence of a military spirit, attitudes in the predominance of the military caste in government. And the fifth one is a predominance of the armed forces as the administration or policy of the state. What does military mean for King? From his Nobel Prize lecture of 1964 through his address of the 11th Annual Southern Christian Leadership Conference in August 67, we see that his philosophy that the, quote, war leads to a legacy of human suffering, political turmoil, and spiritual disillusions, and we will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, death, destruction, failure of our defining principles, but on the positive affirmation of peace. At this early stage, militarism for King meant the absence of peace. Over the course of the next 2.5 years, King made slow but consistent steps in defining the relationship between racism, poverty, and militarism. At Howard University on March 2nd, 1965, that was about 3 months after his Nobel speech, he expanded his thoughts on the escalation of the Vietnam War, stating that the war is accomplishing nothing. He, for the first time, called for a negotiated settlement to the expanding war. About 2 months later, on May 24, 1965, at a Southern Christian Leadership Conference retreat, King again called for a negotiated settlement and an end to the U.S. escalation of hostilities in Vietnam, warning that America was a nation suffering from material corruption. On July 2nd, 65, King forcibly declared the war in Vietnam must be stopped. He didn't advocate demonstrations against the war, but his principal focus was America's nationwide oppression of blacks, not American foreign policy. More and more, King is becoming more outspoken and public on the connection of the three evils on moral grounds. Injustice, poverty, and war are all morally wrong, but he is beginning to hint that there is another connection, economics. On August 9th, 65, at a Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a discussion about the value of a resolution defining King's comments on Vietnam. Now, this discussion was by his own people, and that is to say the people that belong to the Southern Christian Leaders Conference. I think we have an obligation as individuals to express our concerns about the peace question, he said. He recognized that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, quote, resources are not sufficient to assume the burden of two major issues. So the debate was there, should we go off into anti-Vietnam or stay where we're at? And by and large, as people said, well, we don't have the money really to go out there and split the scene right now. When asked why he was undertaking this initiative, he said that it is imperative that the U.S., quote, seriously consider halting the bombing in North Vietnam, which started August in 1964. King later declared in August 65 that war is obsolete and opponents should not confuse his creative dissent with disloyalty to the nation. In September 65, King ultimately decided to back away from the peace issue and return to the emphasis on civil rights, although he felt that as a citizen and as a moral leader, he had the right to speak out on a, quote, a question that deals with the survival of mankind. He would put Vietnam away temporarily, but would speak out when necessary. His individual views versus the larger Southern Christian leadership view. In late October 65, King pointed out that the movement could not ignore violence and racism when they appear in the international arena. Violence is as wrong in Hanoi as it is in Harlem, he said, but I speak as an individual and as a minister, not as the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. See, there was a duality there that at that point in time that he was talking about. I cannot stand by idly and see what war continually escalates without speaking out against it. On January 6th in 1966, Johnson's Vietnam venture meant that domestic social programs would be trimmed back more and more. That's what happened. There was issues in Chicago that was trying to open up housing. There was issues with education around the country. This was all going to take money and federal money, and Johnson basically took the money and sent it to Vietnam. February 2, 1966, in Atlanta, King worried that he was shirking a moral responsibility if he didn't speak out more strongly about the war. It is just as evil to kill Vietnamese as it is to kill Americans, he said. It was one more reminder that peace abroad and racial injustice at home were, quote, inexplicably bound together. Huge military expenditures had wreaked havoc with anti-poverty programs at home. They neglected the neglected poor in the U.S. must be regarded as a priority more than a sordid military adventure. On May 26, 66, the Chicago slums and the L.A. riots and the need for $100 million was called for, but the soaring cost of Vietnam would prevent their implementation. The problem of civil rights, open housing, education, and justice was a lack of economic justice. Money, the poor, the slums. To make programs work, there needed to be money for them and money in the hands of the oppressed. On October 13, 1966, at Frogmore, a place where they had a number of conferences over the years, a switch to class issues, privilege against the underprivileged. Something is wrong with the economic system of our nation, something wrong with capitalism. He saw the issue there that when you deal with money like that and see the money as the whole thing of it, that separating people by their money, by their class, was an issue of capitalism. On December 2nd, King saw the press releases on how Johnson planned to reduce its anti-poverty spending because of the increasing Vietnam War cost. After dealing with Chicago and Mayor Daley, who they were trying to open housing at that time in Chicago, they were trying to make education better, King decided to take 2 months off, go to Jamaica, and write his next book, Where Do We Go From Here? And I hope this comes up, view, excuse me. This was a magazine, Rampart magazine, that King was shown in Jamaica in December of 1966, The Children of Vietnam. Let's see. I'm not quite sure how to do this, but these were the pictures that he saw. One arm, napalm, okay. These photos were taken in Rampart magazine, The Children of Vietnam. King said at that time, "Nothing will ever taste any good for me until I do everything I can to end the war. It is destroying the soul of our nation." And this is at the time when liberal organizations approached King and asked him if he would give a speech about anti-Vietnam. And the speech was held on February 25th, 1967, called The Casualties of War in Vietnam. But the stronger, more casual issues are the casualties of principle, he said. The principles, one, the violation of Vietnam War against the U.S. Charter. That was an issue that support for Vietnam was causing. Two, principle two is the principle of self-determination. U.S. is supporting a new form of colonialism. Three, war plays havoc with domestic issues. The poor, the Negro, the lower class, and all others are all secondary to the war. Fourth principle, our technology, military power has made us arrogant. Money can do anything. The fifth principle is the principle of dissent. Peacekeepers are repressed. Free speech is being shot down like the bombs in Vietnam. Sixth, war is normalized. 7, saying we stop war is not enough. We must, quote, love peace and sacrifice for it. Like the prodigal son, American has strayed to the far country of racism and militarism. Time to call upon America to return to brotherhood and peaceful pursuits. There is, however, another kind of power that America can and should be. It is a moral power, a power harnessed to the service of peace and human beings. We must show the world our moral power, he said. On March 25th, 67, when asked if anti-war militarism and civil rights were incompatible, King said, no, civil rights and opposition to the war were very compatible concerns. The war is hurting us in all our programs to end slums and to end segregation in school and to end the long night of poverty. America had to realize that international violence was just as immoral for humanity as racial segregation. It is our moral commitment to dignity and the worth of human personality that I feel it is necessary to stand up against the war in Vietnam. And this is where the crux of MLK's anti-militarism lies. It's immorality. Besides a huge waste of money that can be used to improve our social structure, militarism perpetuates racism. poverty, and the disparagement between the social classes in America. And April 4th, he gave his biggest speech of all at the Riverside Church in New York. It was called Beyond Vietnam. He gave 7 reasons to align the Vietnam War with his struggle in social causes. 1, war is the enemy of the poor. Of course it is. 2, if blacks and whites can fight together, why can't they live together? It wasn't because they didn't want to. It was because there's systematic operation there that kept them apart. 3, one must love your enemy. In the Christian ethos, we must speak for the weak. 4, we must speak for them, both friend and enemy, as a child of God and brother to the suffering. 5, Vietnam showed us a symptom of having a thing-oriented society versus a person-oriented society. Boy, oh boy, that rings true today. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole. And finally, love of everyone is God. These are all King's words. Now, after the speech was given, there was some major criticism weighted against King. The New York Times says this is a fusing of 2 public problems that are distinct and separate. By drawing them together, Dr. King has done a disservice to both. I'm afraid New York Times just didn't see the connection, didn't see how military, poverty, and materialism work together. The Washington Post said, Dr. Martin Luther King's Vietnam speech was not a sober and responsible comment on the war, but a reflection on his disappointment at the slow progress of civil rights and the war on poverty. He has done a grave injury to his natural allies and a graver injury to himself. I got a feeling the Washington Post just didn't see the connection. The most affirmative response was by the Detroit Free Press. They came out and said that Dr. King called on Americans to protest the nation's war in Vietnam. We are adding cynicism to the process of death. We are on the side of the wealthy and the secure while we create a hell for the poor. Somehow this madness must cease. MLK's words on militarism and war were haunting, blunt, and exact. Quote, this war has played havoc with the destiny of the entire world. It has torn up the Geneva Agreement. It has seriously impaired the United Nations. It has exacerbated the hatred between continents and, worse still, between races. It has frustrated our development at home, telling us, our underprivileged citizens, that we place insatiable military demands above their critical needs. It has greatly contributed to the forces of reaction in America and strengthened the military-industrial complex. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's home with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of people's humanity, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Today, there's kind of a new definition of militarism. When you go to war, the military moves from a defensive posture to an offensive one. What does that mean? In the military, the shift from the role of defense, where we protect the founding principles of this country, and those principles are the principles of respect for all, the principle of causing no harm, principles of equality and compassion, fundamental principles of morality, the principles of staying within our laws, and the principles of humility, truthfulness, fairness, and honor. All these are changed when the role is moved from defense to offense, where the role of the wealthy, secure, and privileged now shift from and take precedence over those founding principles. So the same thing happened when our domestic police moved towards militarism. Instead of treating all equally, when civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model, the poor and the minority become a secondary interest to the wealthy and privileged. Because of the interconnection between the three evils, people of a different race become the enemy, and the poor become the enemy, and they must be dealt with strong-arm tactics to eliminate these enemies through the use of military, i.e. the police force. King would surely recognize that warlike actions abroad inevitably lays the groundwork for warlike actions directed inward. In this way, the war on drugs and the war on terror have created amorphous, nondescript enemies in a battlefield near you. The initiation of these wars is rooted in the fears that stem from racist and xenophobic ideas, and the execution of these wars have led to countless casualties in oppressed communities, regardless of national borders. Militarism on police departments is a threat to civil rights. As noted, local law enforcement goes beyond mere military armament. It also requires military strategies, that is, SWAT teams, and intelligence structures, data sets and analysis, facial recognition, location tracking, social media monitor. Counterinsurgency strategies and tactics that our government deploy in global threats of conflict should not be used in our communities, but they are. The machinery of repression at the heart of these three evils is always evolving, always being upgraded. We must do everything we can to hinder its insidious function today. The dangers of police militarism. One is the decline in public trust for law enforcement agencies. Two, the trapping of the militaries, that is AK-47s, military uniforms, armored vehicles, SWAT teams, have all gone too far. Three, a general lack of oversight, no warrants, no-knock raids, lack of protection of the innocent is another danger by the police militarization. Four, higher levels of force against civilians. That happens all the time where they throw them in the street and beat them to death. The glorification of war over helping locals. Militarism is ineffective against drugs and gangs. What should be done? Currently, there is no one like MLK in our society, and very few today who state a strong connection between militarism and morality, few clergy, politicians, or civilians. When we see pictures of war-torn children in Gaza, we rightfully see the evilness of war, the lack of morals by the aggressors. But there is no obvious direct action, no one stepping up to take the claim about the immorality of the war, like King did. After looking back and analyzing King's words and sentiments about Vietnam and militarism in general, we see nothing today quite as powerful and direct as King's sentiment. There's really nothing different in King's philosophical assessment of war and militarism today as applied to Ukraine and Gaza. War is still immoral. The disease of militarism. Quote, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. We see this in the social inequality assessed against minorities, Black Lives Matter, and how we continue to support both financially and attitudinally the inequalities associated with wars in Gaza and Ukraine, all under the guise of defending democracy. Currently, we see no major anti-war actions, small groups, but no one with the same forum as king? Where do we go from here? When I thought about that question, where do we go from here, I ran into a short, maybe 2-minute speech that King gave in August 16th, 1967. So I decided to let you listen to it because it's a wonderful speech, and it sums up kind of his idea about militarism and how it fits in with the other two evils. If I can get this to work. All right, where is it? Oh, wrong one. So, sorry.
Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. And if you will let me be a preacher just a little bit. One night a juror came to Jesus. And he wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach of what you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, Nicodemus, now you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something altogether different because Jesus realized something basic. That if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore, they will exploit them and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again.
I found that clip very appealing. He connects the issues very clearly, something he's been trying to do and hinting around for years, very clear, showing the interconnectedness between them and how one leads to the other. And militarism is central to much of his thing there. How would King see militarism today? Probably very similar to how he saw it 60 years ago. Militarism continues to segregate the rich from the poor and continues to maintain the privilege of materialism over equality and continues to keep racial barriers in place. We must band together to overcome these three evils: materialism, poverty, and militarism. Thank you.
So before we leave, one thing to emphasize is that military and peace are not incompatible. The Joint Chiefs of Staffs in January 2021 stated that the actions of January 6th were a direct assault on the U.S. Congress, the Capitol building, and our constitutional process. So this is the Joint Chiefs of Staff that's saying this. The rights of freedom of speech and assembly do not give anyone the right to resort to violence, sedition, or insurrection. Any acts to disrupt constitutional process not only violate military values, but the law. And soldiers are told not to obey an illegal command. So the military, stands up for rights to some extent. However, you have to worry about creeping militarism. Defense spending, for example. You have to have money to support the troops, right? Well, the troops are only like about 20% of the military budget that goes to the actual military. The rest is defense contractors and things like that. Organizations need to be audited, organizations that spend money. And in the last audit, 7 of 29 components received passing marks. So 21 did not receive passing marks. And the military has never had a complete audit done successfully. And war has to be paid for, which means reduced funding for human projects. Militarism affects civilian life too. Police department use military equipment and they have military-like training. A lot of ex-military are in the police and do the training. Police have paramilitary teams and practices. And a lot of the police, not all by any means, but a lot see citizens as enemies, not as someone to help. Also, as far as militarism and civilian life, sports and video games glorify military, glorify conflict. And military leaders dominate positions related to national security to the detriment of diplomatic solutions. So you want to go in there and fight first instead of talk about it. So what can we do about this? Well, one thing is get your news from factual sources, which is getting more difficult as the days go by. And if you find an actual factual source, support them with financial contributions. Support groups that promote Dr. King's ideals. Vote. Well, can't vote for the current administration, but in the future, vote, support, and work for candidates that you believe in. And in closing, as Bill said earlier, in Dr. King's 1967 Riverside speech, King laid down this challenge. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. So, thank you, and are there any questions or comments?
All right, thank you both for what I thought was a good overview, including of the 3 evils. And one thing that stuck out, especially initially, was the cynicism. And you see a lot of reporting on surveys showing decreased trust in public institutions pretty much across the board. And I sometimes feel that's like a little bit too binary, among other things, that is, and focus on like trust itself, which is not unimportant, but I think we're often not getting to the undergirding things, whether it's the 3 evils or basic capitalistic erosion of that trust, which I feel conservatives use to kind of undermine the potential of that is in a cynical way, right? Let's say we can't even do certain things, solve big problems. Let's even say small c capitalistic problems because we're cynical about public institutions and thus the ability of people to redress grievances, et cetera. And so I was wondering if you maybe have you've already talked a bit about it, but sort of looking forward, how we might address that. Do we keep talking about the 3 evils and the interrelatedness and interconnections and heighten the contradictions, as I said at the time, as applied to contemporary things like what do you see maybe some points of purchase and intervention points?
What kind of bothers me is the defense budget, $900 million. And we don't have a clue on where it's being spent. Hasn't been an audit of the defense budget in years. They just get the money. This year, matter of fact, they said they needed $850 million, and Congress gave them an extra $50 million to make it 900. What were they going to use it for? They didn't know. They just, military gets the money, gets the money. There is an organization, there is a group of people right now who want to take $100 million of the defense budget, take it and spit it out for education, all sorts of social events, social things like that, $100 million from the defense budget, which they probably wouldn't even miss. So it's that type of thing. They got all this money, they do whatever they want to, they don't tell us what they're going to do for it. There's more money spent in the military than the rest of the government together, and certainly more money spent in the U.S. military than, I heard somewhere, than all the other countries combined. So it's that type of, well, that leads to cynicism, that's for sure. So.
Yeah, the U.S. military budget is bigger than the next, I think, 10 budgets, including the Soviet, China, the next 10. Ours is bigger than that. One thing that troubles me is that, well, two things. One is retired military going into the defense industry. So you're a general, and you know a lot of people there, and you retire, and now you work for General Dynamics. And so you talk to your buddies and say, hey, we got this really cool system. Why don't you talk to your congressman and get them to fund it for $4 or $5 billion? There's a lot of that going on. Also, the military right now is a professional organization in that you volunteer for the military, and that's your career. What I would like to see, and this is a personal opinion, not Veterans for Peace, is to have the draft again. But to have the draft, so when you turn 18, you do something for the country. You join the military, you join the Peace Corps, you work in a hospital, something like that. Because when I was in, back in 1968 to 71, I was drafted. And the people that were drafted, saw the military different than someone who volunteered for it and wanted to be there. And I think it kept the higher-ups more on their toes about, what they should do and what they shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-military. I spent 4 years in there and recognized the situation pretty clearly. But it's when, the bureaucrats spending the money, wasting the money, and that we have no idea on how it's being spent, that's bothersome to me. Something needs to be done in that regard. So, any other thoughts? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate